World War II was reaching its dramatic climax.
Rocket ships firing, aircraft flying overhead.
As the Allies waged total war to liberate occupied Europe.
This was a war in which all sides were learning as they went.
From the beaches of Normandy,
the water was full of blood. The water was bright red.
To the forests of Germany.
Ich sehe dort heute noch die ganzen Toten liegen.
Both sides deployed weapons of ever greater power and sophistication.
And this tank suddenly gives the American a real big advantage. It's a very effective beast.
This is the story of the Western Allies' final campaign, told by the men on both sides who were there.
You did what you did. You fire and you maneuver.
He was my brother.
September 1944. The Western Allies were closing in on the German heartland. But now, the formidable defences of the Siegfried Line stood in their path. So the Allies came up with a daring plan to bypass the German defences and cross the River Rhine in a single bound, with the largest deployment of airborne infantry ever seen.
We all knew that Market Garden was a very big deal from the moment we saw the airborne going overhead.
But the elite Allied soldiers sent into battle soon discovered the plan was badly flawed.
It was a disaster, from beginning to end.
And that it was never wise to underestimate the German army.
You was in for a fight. No two ways about it.
There were an awful lot of Germans in the Netherlands, and we found them.
This is the story of Operation Market Garden. The D-Day landings of June 1944 had been followed by weeks of grueling fighting in Normandy. But finally, the Western Allies had forced the German army into headlong retreat. German losses were enormous. 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, as well as thousands of vehicles and heavy weapons destroyed. That September, the German army was still desperately trying to rebuild its forces in the West and preparing for a final battle to defend Germany itself. But just at the moment the Germans seemed beaten, the Allies were running into their own difficulties.
In September 1944, the Allies were suffering a severe supply shortage because their supplies still had to be brought to the front line from the Normandy beaches. The Germans knew about this, and they knew that the Allied advance had slowed down mainly because of a lack of supplies.
What the Allies needed to solve their supply crisis was a channel port, but they were either still in German hands or, like Cherbourg, had been comprehensively sabotaged by the Germans before their liberation. The Allied supply lines were now 300 miles long and could no longer deliver enough fuel and ammunition to frontline units to sustain the pace of the advance. But British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had a bold plan, one which he believed would allow the Allies to sidestep the supply crisis and end the war by Christmas 1944. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, or Monty, had commanded all Allied land forces during the D-Day landings and the Normandy campaign. But now US troops outnumbered British and Canadian. It was no longer politically acceptable for a British general to command them. So Churchill had promoted Monty to Field Marshal, while he was effectively demoted to command the mostly British and Canadian 21st Army Group. Allied intelligence reports indicated that the Germans' northern flank, opposite 21st Army Group, was lightly defended. So Monty proposed that his force attack north from Belgium into the Netherlands, bypassing Germany's strongest defences along the Siegfried Line, to encircle Germany's industrial heartland in the Ruhr Valley and pave the way for a direct advance on Berlin. He named his plan Operation Market Garden. But Monty would have to sell the plan to the Supreme Allied Commander, American General Dwight Eisenhower, who had his own plan for the advance.
Eisenhower was content, for political reasons and for alliance reasons, to keep the advance more or less even across the front. This is the so-called broad front advance, that everybody would share the risks and share the achievements. This is very much Eisenhower's style, but there simply weren't enough resources for this. What Montgomery wanted was to divert the resources to a northern arm, the so-called narrow front attack. And he believed that if this was done, then he could get through to the Ruhr early enough to end the war in a matter of months.
But if Monty was going to get extra supplies for Operation Market Garden, someone else would have to lose out.
The personal politics of Market Garden are also quite fascinating. Montgomery lobbied Eisenhower ruthlessly and without end to carry out this operation. Montgomery knew that any resources given to him would be taken away from the Americans like Patton farther south, and he lobbied Eisenhower until Eisenhower finally gave in and gave Montgomery his pet airborne operation.
Montgomery got his supplies, as well as use of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, an elite force of 40,000 British, American and Polish soldiers, ready to be dropped behind enemy lines by parachute and glider. Montgomery made these troops the cornerstone of a bold, ambitious plan that required clockwork precision. British 30th Corps was to advance 64 miles along a single road from the Belgian border to the Dutch town of Arnhem, but their route crossed several rivers and canals, including 2 major branches of the lower Rhine. So 3 Allied airborne divisions would drop ahead of the ground forces to seize key bridges along the route, including 2 major bridges over the lower Rhine at Nijmegen and Arnhem, before the Germans could destroy them or organize their defense. The bridges were well defended by anti-aircraft guns to ward off Allied bombers, so the airborne troops were to land several miles from their targets and complete their approach on foot. The airborne assault was codenamed Market, the ground attack Garden. The spearhead of Lieutenant General Horrock's 30th Corps was the Guards Armoured Division, with 268 tanks, mostly Shermans. They'd be supported by the 43rd Wessex and 50th Northumbrian Infantry Divisions, tanks of the 8th Armoured Brigade and Royal Engineer bridging units. Airborne troops were under the command of Lieutenant General Browning's British 1st Airborne Corps, made up of British 1st Airborne Division, a Polish parachute brigade, and 2 US divisions attached for the operation, the 82nd and 101st Airborne. The Royal Air Force and US Army Air Force would provide 1,500 transport aircraft and 500 gliders to get troops to their targets. Lieutenant General Boy Browning, commanding the Allied airborne troops, was Britain's senior airborne officer, married to the famous novelist Daphne du Maurier. Seen by some as difficult to work with, relations with his American boss, 1st Allied Airborne Army Commander Lieutenant General Brereton, were particularly strained. In the run-up to the operation, reports arrived that German SS Panzer units had been seen near Arnhem, the British airborne objective. A British intelligence officer took the reports to Browning.
The Corps intelligence officer, a chap called Van Urquhart, he warned us that there were 2 SS Panzer divisions lined up from Arnhem to Zutphen, and that he had warned General Browning about this, and he said Browning's plan for the operation would fail unless he altered them to take account of these 2 divisions, and Browning had told him that he was not to tell any of us about it, and that he did not believe that the tanks really were operable because they'd just been fighting in the Normandy.
If there were German panzer units near Arnhem, the entire operation would probably be called off. And Browning and many others in the elite airborne corps were determined to press ahead. The Netherlands had fallen to German blitzkrieg in May 1940, but since then the country had remained relatively unscathed by global war.
Das war wie Friedenszeiten. In Holland war schien die Welt für uns noch in Ordnung. Das lag einmal daran, dass die Wetterbedingungen hervorragend waren. Wir hatten sehr schöne Straßenverhältnisse mit Baumbewuchs, mit Alleen, sodass man sich auch am Tage bewegen konnte. Man war gegen Luftangriffe zumindest geschützt oder schien geschützt zu sein. Man konnte nicht so leicht entdeckt werden.
But on the night of the 16th of September, British and American bombers struck German airfields and anti-aircraft positions across the Netherlands. At 9:45 a.m. the next day, thousands of aircraft of the 1st Airborne Army took off from their bases in England and set course for their drop zones. The vast air armada formed up in 2 columns, 3 miles across and a staggering 94 miles long.
There were planes still taking off in England while men were dropping in Holland. That's how vast it was. You could actually step over from one plane to another all the way across the channel to Holland from England.
Johnny Peters was in one of the leading British gliders, with clear views ahead.
Right, when we went over the North Sea, we could see the air sea rescue boats in there, our channel men, so it was very reassuring to see these air sea rescue boats in case we ditched in the sea.
It was a beautiful flight. Blazing sun, a huge convoy, about 3 miles wide, all full of planes. Extraordinary sight, wonderful sight.
One of the largest gliders taking part in Market Garden was the Airspeed Horsa. A British design built mostly of spruce and plywood, its prefabricated sections were often put together by furniture makers. The Horsa carried 2 pilots and 25 troops, or loads such as a jeep or a small anti-tank gun. Allied gliders were towed towards the landing zone by transport aircraft or bombers, then released to glide silently down towards their target. Although they weren't guaranteed a smooth landing, gliders did an excellent job of dropping a unit onto its target without scattering them, as often happened in parachute drops. As the first wave of Operation Market reached the Netherlands, they discovered that plenty of German anti-aircraft guns had survived the previous night's raid by Allied bombers.
The ACAC gunners fired in the front of us. Shortly afterwards, a cry went up from the back of the glider, the tail's coming off. Now, this was relayed from the back to the front. I was sitting in the front behind the pilots, and my sergeant was sitting opposite, and he relayed that back to the pilot. He sent Ralph Maltby to have a look. He came back, big grin on his face, say, "You're all right. The fabric's being hit. It's only flapping about, but the tail's not coming off." So he sat down. We were very reassured about that.
It was a narrow escape for everyone on board. But as Johnny Peters' glider approached the landing zone, they came under more fire, and the co-pilot was hit.
I knew he died by the look on Sergeant Watson's face. Then you think to yourself, well, what would happen if the pilot get killed? None of us could pilot the glider. The German machine gunners were firing their bullets, and they were coming through the glider, and only one bullet hit a bloke named Private Hughes in the leg, but he made a good landing.
In most landing zones, German air defences were light and caught off guard. Most gliders touched down safely in open farmland. The parachute drops went almost exactly according to plan. Of the 1,000 transport aircraft used on the first day, just 27 were destroyed.
We weren't under fire at all coming in. It was really nice. It was on a Sunday afternoon, about 1 o'clock. Sun was shining, and it was an ideal type of operation, I call it.
The British 1st Airborne Division landed 6 to 8 miles northwest of Arnhem with near total surprise.
It was a perfect summer's day. We landed with no opposition at all.
The US 82nd Airborne, landing near Nijmegen, were immediately welcomed by Dutch locals.
While we were picking up our equipment, all the Dutch civilians were coming out of the tree line, and they're all speaking perfect English. And I said to my buddy, are we still in England or is this Holland? They spoke perfect English. They wanted to tell us where the Germans were, and we wanted to get them off the landing zone so they wouldn't get hit.
Meanwhile, the US 101st Airborne landed further south, near Eindhoven. Second Lieutenant Frank Gregg received a less friendly reception.
I landed and right on the drop zone, and it was filled with big Holstein cows, milk cows. And they panicked, of course, when all these parachutes started coming down. And I'm thinking, oh man, I'd hate to have to write home from the hospital said I was severely wounded by a big Holstein cow or something like that, or even killed by one, because they were really running around in the pasture.
The US airborne troops quickly took control of the road between Eindhoven and Nijmegen. The Netherlands had been under Nazi occupation for 4 years, but the arrival of the Allied forces came as a huge delight for its citizens, especially for members of one of the best organized resistance groups in Europe.
I got all my troops to the bridge, and about the time I got my foot on one end of the bridge, a Dutchman and a very pretty girl stepped on the other end. They were in a black leather coats like the Germans wore, and both carrying submachine guns slung over their shoulders. And I said, I'm not sure these people are friendly. So anyway, the girl came bursting over toward me and said, we are from the Dutch underground, and we are here to help you in any way you need help. I thanked her and so forth. She gave me a briefing on that there were no enemy in town. It was clear of Germans.
The airborne part of the operation had started well. Most troops had landed on or close to their intended drop zone. Now they needed to secure the vital bridges along 30th Corps' route to the Rhine. But the Allies didn't have it all their own way. A dash to the Arnhem Bridge by British paratroopers in jeeps hit a German roadblock. Most were killed or captured. The paras would have to reach the bridge on foot, but it would be a hard slog.
One of the first mistakes that Browning made, he dropped us 7 miles from the bridge, and we were all carrying about 80 pounds worth of equipment and weapons. You can't run all the way. Merely walking take about 4 hours.
Problems were developing elsewhere too. North of Eindhoven, German engineers and Luftwaffe trainees blew up bridges over the Wilhelmina Canal before US paratroopers could reach them. 30 miles northeast at Nijmegen, more bridges across the Maas-Waal Canal were blown before the 82nd Airborne got to them. Back in Arnhem, British 1st Airborne was about to run into the SS Panzer units that Major Urquhart had tried to warn of. Fortunately, they were well below full strength.
One of the legends, shall we say, about Operation Market Garden was that 1st British Airborne Division, which dropped at Arnhem, was dropping on top of 2 SS armoured divisions, 2 SS Panzer divisions. That is true in the sense that 9th and 10th SS Panzer Division were in the area, but they had been so badly destroyed in the Battle of Normandy and the subsequent retreat They were really only as strong as what the Germans called Kampfgruppe, that is to say, something about the size of a weak division with not too many tanks. But even in those terms, the Allies were taking a risk which really only made sense if the Germans weren't going to fight. And they did.
Another surprise for British 1st Airborne was that they'd landed almost on top of German Army Group B headquarters, from where Field Marshal Model would orchestrate a rapid German response. Model was Germany's youngest field marshal and greatly admired by Hitler and other senior commanders for his performance on the Eastern Front. He had been nicknamed the Führer's fireman for his ability to salvage apparently disastrous situations, even when his forces were heavily outnumbered.
The fact that he is a completely driven, also committed soldier are summed up by many accounts that we see, that he was very tough and very hard against his own troops, because he really wanted to achieve things, but also very hard and tough against himself, and for that the people admired and respected him.
As German commanders planned their response to the landings, they were handed a gift. In the wreckage of a crashed Allied glider, German troops found a complete set of orders for Operation Market Garden. Model saw that if he could hold the Allies at Nijmegen, the British paratroopers at Arnhem would remain cut off, and the Allied operation would fail. He split 2nd SS Panzer Corps into Kampfgruppe, or battle groups. Kampfgruppe Hohenstaufen was to hold Arnhem and its bridge against the British, while Kampfgruppe Frundsberg raced south over Arnhem Bridge to prevent the Allies crossing at Nijmegen.
The concept of Battlegroup, or Kampfgruppe in German, is a very specific concept that you could find in the German army in the Second World War. The idea was that whenever the need arose, you would form ad hoc formations out of existing formations, quite often of broken up formations or formations that already received or taken a lot of casualties, and form a new fighting body out of these.
Improvised Kampfgruppen helped Germany make the most of its dwindling military strength and respond rapidly to new threats.
Ihr geht da runter, ihr müsst euch beeilen, kämpft alles nieder, was ihr euch im Weg stellt, und ihr müsst dann alle zusammen mit den anderen, die dort ankommen, einen Kessel bilden.
The swift German response meant Allied airborne troops were soon engaged in heavy fighting. At 2:35 p.m, the Allied ground attack began. Tanks of British 30th Corps crossed the Dutch-Belgian border on the road to Arnhem. Working to a strict timetable, they needed to reach Eindhoven by the end of the day, but the single road through open country was highly exposed. Within 10 minutes, they were hit by a German ambush and lost several tanks.
We were being fired on from the flanks as we pushed up the road. I don't know if you know Holland, but it was then just a series of country roads. There was nowhere to go. The tank wouldn't go off the road, he'd sink, because Holland was built on water.
You travelled on dike roads most of the time, and travelling on dike roads in the dark and the wet is not very comfortable at times.
With air support from Typhoon fighter bombers, the British tanks pushed on, along what soon became known as Hell's Highway. 30th Corps only managed to advance 5 miles on the first day, failing to reach Eindhoven, which remained in German hands. Just 24 hours into the operation, and Market Garden was already behind schedule. Allied airborne units were now in heavy fighting for a series of bridges that 30th Corps would need for their advance through the Netherlands into Germany itself. The 101st Airborne Division had successfully captured the crossings at Eindhoven. The 82nd, tasked with capturing the bridges at Nijmegen, were just south of their objective, at Grave. But at Arnhem, British 1st Airborne was in trouble. About 5,000 men were scattered west of town, in heavy fighting with local German forces, as well as the Waffen-SS troops. Only around 300 men had managed to reach their objective, the Arnhem Road Bridge, and were now dug in at its northern end, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Frost. John Frost was an experienced officer and one of the first to join the newly formed Parachute Regiment in 1941. He'd led daring missions into German-held territory before, including the successful Bruneval raid on the coast of occupied France to steal top-secret German radar equipment. Now he was in command of the tiny force of British paratroopers who had got through to the objective. As night fell, John Frost radioed divisional headquarters that they had secured the northern end of the bridge. He was ordered to hold his position until 30th Corps reached him. Around 9 p.m, Frost was reinforced by a group led by Major Tony Hibbert.
We had been ordered in the brigade orders that our job was to capture Arnhem Bridge and hold it for 48 hours until we were relieved from the south. Well, we'd actually done the job. We'd captured the bridge. We held the north end of it, which was the only bit that was necessary.
On day 2 of the operation, Frost's small force remained dug in around the north end of Arnhem Bridge, cut off from the rest of their division.
There were about nearly 600 chaps at John Frost's disposal, and he disposed them into a tight perimeter, but he could only go so far as he had chaps.
Then the paratroopers heard the sound of vehicles approaching from the south. It must be 30th Corps come to relieve them.
We thought that the tanks were in fact our own tanks coming from the south, the ones that were actually going to relieve us. And it was quite extraordinary. We had, as I say, about 160 people on the bridge, and they all took off their helmets and put their berets on and came out to cheer them forward. And of course, it wasn't until they came up to the top of the bridge that we saw that they'd got the wrong insignia on.
The vehicles belonged to an SS reconnaissance unit. When they realized the bridge was in British hands, they tried to rush it. But the paratroopers were ready.
And you could see the fear on their face, what they were running into. We had 3 para under there, and they opened up and they killed all those people that charged over the bridge.
The German column was wiped out in a barrage of fire from small arms, anti-tank guns, and the British Army's unique anti-tank weapon, the Piat.
For the first 2 years of the Second World War, the British had a really ineffective anti-tank rifle. But in August 1942, the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, or Piat, was introduced. It's an unusual-looking weapon and very cumbersome. It's very heavy. It's about 15 kilograms in weight. It was really important that you got very, very close to the target. Ideally, if you're trying to knock out a tank, you want to be to the side of it, on its flank, or even better, behind it. You'd then sight it using this very simple upright foresight. So you'd pull the trigger, the spring would shoot forward, hit the detonator at the back of the bomb flies forward, the detonator would then recock the spring, ready for the next round to be put in it. One of the problems with it was that the tail end of the bomb was hollow, so it acted like a rifle barrel, so as it exploded, it would then fire the remains of the detonator straight back towards the Piat operator, so you'd have to duck out the way as soon as you'd fired. They were incredibly effective. There were some unit commanders that said that this was the most effective weapon that their section carried. It was also successful. There were more tanks knocked out with Piats than there were by rocket-firing Typhoons and Tempests.
On day 2, major British airborne reinforcements set off from England after a 4-hour delay due to morning mist. This second wave had no element of surprise, and as they approached the landing zone west of Arnhem, they came under heavy anti-aircraft fire. Bill Higgs was one of the glider pilots.
The Jerrys are already sized out where we're going to land them, because the landing ground was a big open space, you see, miles, and of course the Germans soon surrounded it with their guns, and they were knocking them out in the air and
as I was flying over, you could see a puff there, a puff there, a puff there.
Ich will nicht sagen, das war wie Tontaubenschießen, das wäre jetzt falsch ausgedrückt. Aber zuerst konnten wir das gar nicht begreifen, dass die das noch vorhaben da.
Not only were the British under fire on the way in, but on the ground they found the Germans already attacking the landing zones themselves.
They were all around and they were really knocking us for six. But I got down by these trees and I thought, I can get in by the trees. If I can get to the trees, I haven't got far to run, you see. So.
The surviving reinforcements gradually assembled, ready to move out. But there was another problem. The commander of British 1st Airborne Division, Major General Urquhart, had landed on day one, but was now missing in Arnhem, which was swarming with German troops. To make matters worse, British radios weren't working. Frost's men at the bridge couldn't reach division headquarters just 3.5 miles away, or Corps HQ near Nijmegen.
When we got there, the signals didn't work, so that was a waste for a start.
I felt that because I couldn't even talk to my men, that I wasn't doing my job.
One of the things that caused Market Garden to go wrong almost immediately was the complete chaos and lack of communication in most of the drop zones. Especially around Arnhem, the paratroopers had been scattered so widely and so far away from their targets that they had little idea of where they were or what to do. In addition, their radios proved not to work all that effectively, and so they couldn't even talk to each other and figure out what was going on.
By the time of the Market Garden operation, the radio sets that were taken to Arnhem, there were 4 different types, and the set that was used between the companies and battalion was the wireless set 68. And that was very, very similar to this 18 set, which was the standard infantry radio set. It had links of copper aerial that slotted together. Wireless operators always used to say it was like having an enormous neon sign above you, this huge great aerial waving around telling the enemy where you were, which wasn't very popular. There were many problems with the radio communications at Arnhem, and a lot of those were known about before they set off. The whole thing was a gamble, and they gambled on the fact that radio equipment which really wasn't quite up to the job would just about do the job. They gambled on the fact that they'd got enough radio operators because inevitably, being an airborne operation, they'd cut down on the amount of people that they could take with them. And the problem with that, of course, is that once radio operators started becoming casualties and were killed and wounded, there were no trained operators to replace them. Some of the radios had batteries which were disposable, and obviously the problem with that is resupply in the middle of a combat zone. Other radios had rechargeable batteries, and again, in a combat zone, that was a very tricky thing to do, to gather radio batteries, get them back to a place where they could be recharged. But the big problem was procedure. In a lot of instances, they simply didn't follow the agreed procedure. The whole division changed their frequency for the radios. But by that stage, the divisional headquarters were already out of contact with the brigade that was trying to get through to Arnhem Bridge. So when they changed their frequency, there wasn't a hope of getting back in contact with them because they'd got no idea that the frequency had been changed.
Tony Hibbert set up 8 large wireless sets at his headquarters near the bridge.
But the problem was that they had been set up really for work in the open. And from the moment we reached Arnhem, we were out of touch.
While Frost and his men remained cut off at the north end of Arnhem Bridge, the rest of the 1st Airborne Division battled to reach them, in vain. The casualties were starting to mount.
You know, you was in for a fight. No two ways about it. And the Germans knew that they were reinforcing quicker than what we were. Our medics were filling up. Now and again, the general would say, Bloisy, go and see what the check is, you know, and you go in. Sometimes you shout to them and they'd give you by signs, you know, numbers. And that sometimes you went in there and these chaps be laying all around the wall, you couldn't get any more in there.
Meanwhile, 40 miles southwest of Arnhem, 30th Corps had reached their first objective, the Dutch city of Eindhoven. and linked up with the US 101st Airborne. Jubilant Dutch civilians cheered the British tanks as they passed through, half a day behind schedule. Their next objective was Nijmegen, but the city and its bridge were still in German hands.
When we got to Nijmegen, the Grenadier Guards in Shermans were in the lead, but when they got there, the American paratroops had not captured the bridge, which meant they had to fight for the bridge.
An attack on the bridge would mean more crucial hours lost, but there was no other option. On day 3, a combined assault by British tanks, infantry, and US paratroopers attempted to seize Nijmegen and its bridge, but ran into fierce German resistance. The attack failed. Back in Arnhem, Lieutenant General Urquhart had managed to rejoin his division, but breaking through to John Frost's men at the north end of the bridge looked increasingly unlikely. The rest of the division was now surrounded in the western suburb of Oosterbeek, struggling to hold its own position. Colonel Frost's force, just a few hundred strong, clung on desperately at the bridge as German attacks intensified.
We're doing very well for the first 3 or 4 hours. And then, of course, the Germans put their artillery units on the other side of the river. And from that moment onwards, we were under a continual artillery attack. And on the next day, they started to bring up their tanks.
As the battle at the bridge became increasingly one-sided, the Germans sent a captured British engineer back to Frost's men with a message.
This engineer has come back over the bridge waving a big piece of white, waving it away, and he said, oh, the Germans want to surrender, sir. So he said, well, tell them to do it properly. I want 2 officers with a white sheet to come over and with no arms. No, sir, he said, I didn't mean it that way. He said, I meant they want you to surrender. He said, tell them to sod off. So he said, do you want me to go back? He said, do you want to go back? He said, no, I don't.
For all Frost's determination to fight on at Arnhem, his fate and the fate of his men rested with Allied forces 10 miles to the south at Nijmegen, where the bridge remained in German hands. But the commander of the 82nd Airborne had come up with a plan. Brigadier General James Gavin had been decorated for his role in the invasion of Sicily in 1943, made the night jump into Normandy on D-Day, and just 6 weeks before Market Garden was given command of the elite 82nd Airborne. He was an admired and charismatic leader who insisted that his officers be the first out of the airplane door and the last in the chow line. Faced with stubborn German resistance, Gavin proposed to have the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment cross the Waal 2 miles downriver, so they could then launch an attack on the bridge from both ends. The crossing had to be made in collapsible wood and canvas boats under heavy enemy fire. Half the soldiers in the first wave were either killed or wounded. But with men across the river, the Allies could launch their simultaneous attack on both ends of the bridge. The Germans tried to blow the bridge, but the explosives failed and the surviving defenders fled. The road to Arnhem was open, but the Allied advance along Hell's Highway had been long and arduous, and they were now 30 hours behind schedule. Operation Market Garden's all-important timetable was in tatters. Ray Cumley was driving one of the Welsh Guards' Cromwell tanks, frustrated by their slow advance.
As we crossed, it was almost dusk, and we knocked 2 German tanks out there. But then we were at standstill overnight because we advanced the next day. And of course, when we advanced, we couldn't do it. And of course, the airborne were being closed in by the SS. There was no chance for them. And we were determined if only we could get there, but we couldn't.
At Arnhem, Lieutenant Colonel Frost and his dwindling band of paratroopers still clung on to the north end of the bridge. But as each hour passed, more German reinforcements arrived in Arnhem, and they were now under sustained attack from German artillery, infantry, and armour.
The Germans, having dealt with other pockets of resistance, are now able to regroup their forces and, together with tank support, including Tiger tanks, to launch the last and final attack onto the bridge, and quite quickly they then manage to overrun the British positions, merely because the British are running out of ammunition and supplies, and because a normal paratrooper unit is not equipped to deal with German Tiger tanks.
On the 20th of September, after holding the bridge for 4 days and 5 nights, Frost's men learned that there was no hope of them being relieved as planned. They requested a ceasefire to help with their enormous number of casualties. Brigade Major Tony Hibbert was an eyewitness to the grim scenes.
We had over 300 wounded in the hospital, and the building was on fire, and the flames were out of control. So we had to ask the Germans not only for the ceasefire, but for them to send us some of their men to help us get our wounded out. That took about 2 hours, and at the end of that time, the Germans had infiltrated the perimeter that we'd been defending.
With no ammunition left, Frost's men began to surrender. But some decided to try and rejoin the rest of the division, holed up in Oosterbeek, 2 miles west.
There was no point in trying to defend the bridge, so I split them up into parties of 10 to try and make their way back to the main perimeter in Oosterbeek. But there were too many Germans. Wherever we went, we ran into Germans, and we were all taken prisoner.
During the truce, the German commander sought out his British counterpart.
Colonel Frost. He'd been badly wounded on the second day, still able to talk. The German commander came up and said, Colonel Frost, I salute you. We've just come back from Russia, where they'd been fighting for 2 years. He said, I've never seen any people as brave as yours. I salute you. That was nice.
But the courage and tenacity with which Frost and his men had held their ground had not been enough. Arnhem had proved a bridge too far. The 21st of September, day 5. With Frost's command eliminated, Arnhem Bridge was back in German hands. The rest of the 1st Airborne Division were dug in around Oosterbeek, on the wrong side of the river from British and American forces pushing up from Nijmegen. But 30th Corps' progress along Hell's Highway remained painfully slow, and now British tanks were taking fire from one of Germany's most lethal weapons.
You were sitting ducks, as you might say, because the 88mm guns, these were the anti-tank the German had. I think it was the finest gun ever for tank warfare in particular.
Facing the British armour attack is a very strong German defence in depth. They've got weapons like the famous Pak-43 anti-tank gun. That's one of these ones here behind me. It's an 88mm gun, and it can fire a solid shot, armour-piercing round that would penetrate one of the British Sherman tanks out to about 2.5 kilometres away. So you have the situation that British tanks are being knocked out and they can't even see the enemy that is firing at them.
Each time a German anti-tank gun picked off the lead British tank, the rest of the column was stuck behind it on the single road until the destroyed vehicle could be cleared. Corps Commander Lieutenant General Horrocks ordered his infantry forward, but they too ran into fierce German resistance.
We were desperate to relieve the airborne in Arnhem. The Germans were equally determined that we would not reach them, that they would surrender before we had a chance to cross the River Rhine and get back to them, get them out. And so it was a battle of attrition for 4 or 5 days.
30th Corps was running out of time. At Oosterbeek, the British airborne were critically low on ammunition and water. Attempts to resupply them by air were only partly successful, with most canisters falling behind German lines. And they remained under relentless attack from all sides.
We knew we were losing the battle because we get pulled into a perimeter, getting smaller and smaller, so we knew we weren't going to win it.
30th Corps began looking for alternative ways to reach the airborne troops at Oosterbeek. Their reconnaissance units, using small country lanes, found a route to the river that bypassed the main German defences, and at Driel made contact with the 1st Polish Parachute Brigade, who'd been dropped as reinforcements on day 3. Over the next few days, 30th Corps made several attempts to cross the river and link up with the Paras.
We sent a company of our 4th Dorsets across the river to form a bridge at the other side, so then when the paratroopers were coming back, they knew where they'd get across.
But as airborne resistance north of the river began to collapse, any reinforcements who made it across risked sharing their fate.
I think they sent a whole company across, and not many of them came back. They didn't all get killed, but they got captured.
It was increasingly clear that Operation Market Garden had failed. The British priority became rescuing as many airborne troops as possible from the far shore of the Rhine.
The real issue on the ground at the time was, were the Germans about to overrun 1st Airborne Division's positions with perhaps a resulting massacre? The British knew there were SS troops involved. They were afraid there might be a massacre. In fact, there wasn't. The Waffen-SS troops were generally so impressed with the way that the paratroopers and glider troops had fought that they treated them rather well. But again, in the big picture, it wasn't just about getting across and into Arnhem. It was about getting much further north into Holland with substantial forces. And that clearly was not going to happen at this stage. So the decision is taken to withdraw those forces across the Rhine, rather perhaps sarcastically entitled Operation Berlin.
The way it came through, they were going to pull out at 11 o'clock at night, but don't tell these Dutch people because we think they're pro-German because they live near the border of Germany, and so don't tell them we're pulling out in case they tell the Germans, you know. So we were in this trench, and they were all across the river. The Royal Artillery were firing 2 guns on the extreme right and left. Each one was a tracer, so we were told keep within them tracers, you know, otherwise the shell outside there. And we got to the river, the church, across the river. And now, that was horrendous there. The Germans knew we were getting out. Apparently, they thought at first the Poles were coming in across the river, but then realised we were getting out. So they shelled this place. That was the worst night of my life. And I have nightmares about that. Many.
They managed to get about 2,400 Allied troops across the Rhine that particular night, which practically ends the fighting in the Arnhem area. and the Germans, of course, claimed this as their victory.
The Battle of Arnhem ended amid death and chaos and a humiliating British retreat. The recriminations began almost immediately.
I felt ashamed that, being English, that we was losing the battle through incompetence.
The British performed poorly because they didn't listen. They were good soldiers. They were brave. But the command, they were crazy. Dropping those people over there, knowing the German armor was over there. Dutch people told them, and the British insisted that they were wrong.
Characteristically, Montgomery refused to accept any blame.
Montgomery was an extremely capable commander with a massive ego who had the habit, particularly after the war, of saying that he could pre-plan all his battles perfectly and the enemy never had any say in it. He just carried out his master plan. He also said he never lost a battle. When asked about Market Garden, it was claimed it was a 90% success. That was very typical of the man.
Monty's master plan had not got the Allies across the Rhine and into Germany as promised, and the war would not be over by Christmas. Instead, Eisenhower's broad front strategy would resume once the Allies had resolved their supply crisis, a crisis that had only been exacerbated by Operation Market Garden.
Market Garden drew substantial amount of supplies away from other areas of the Allied front. Most importantly, the Southern American armies, like Patton's Third Army, were starved of fuel and had to slow their advance as a result. Market Garden also distracted Montgomery from other important areas of his responsibility. Most importantly, although the port city of Antwerp was captured, Montgomery neglected to capture the areas leading into the port. The Germans controlled the estuary between Antwerp and the sea, and that meant that the Allies couldn't start using the Antwerp port to bring supplies in for much longer time than they should have.
Operation Market Garden was one of the war's great what-ifs, a chance to shorten the war and so save many thousands of lives squandered through poor planning, and in spite of the heroism and skill of many who took part.
We jumped 17 September, and we were relieved by the Canadians on the 11th of November. We just sat there facing Germany. Just sat there, because it was a, as you British say, it was a cock-up. It was a cock-up. It was a mess, really.
In September 1944, along the Dutch-Belgian border, the Allies began a desperate battle to clear well-entrenched German troops from a key strategic waterway.
The Germans had been there for 4 years. They knew the areas only like the back of their hand. And regardless of what you hear, they were very formidable.
Possession of the Scheldt Estuary was vital for the Allied advance into Germany. But German forces held both shores and would use every advantage offered by treacherous terrain.
Every time you made an advance, the Germans would blow the dikes and flood the land.
It was strewn with mines. Everywhere there was minefield.
The month-long, grueling campaign for this estuary would be Canada's bloodiest battle of World War II. This is the story of the Battle of the Scheldt. By September 1944, Hitler's Germany was staring defeat in the face. That summer, Stalin's Red Army had smashed through German forces on the Eastern Front and advanced as far as Poland and Romania. In the west, the Allies had liberated France and were closing in on the River Rhine and the German frontier. But then an Allied supply crisis brought the advance to a grinding halt.
The Allied industries back home in the United States and Britain were producing enormous amounts of supplies. Tens of thousands of tanks, millions of rounds of ammunition, and millions of gallons of fuel. The challenge was getting all of those supplies to their frontline troops.
The Allies had 5 armies in the field, 2.5 million men advancing on a broad front towards the Rhine. But their supplies still came from their Normandy beachhead, 300 miles to the rear. Frontline troops were no longer getting the fuel and ammunition they needed to continue the advance.
Modern warfare needs lots of petrol. Tanks gobble up petrol more than our cars do.
This is where there was this great argument about how the Allied forces should make their next move, because they were running out of supplies.
Then, on the 4th of September, the British 11th Armoured Division captured the Belgian port of Antwerp. Crucially, with the help of the Belgian resistance, the British were able to capture the port intact before the Germans could sabotage it. At first glance, it seemed as if all the Allied supply issues would soon be at an end.
There are miles and miles and miles of docks there. Antwerp is the biggest, or was then the biggest harbour really in Europe. It was the biggest plum for the British Army.
We had Antwerp, and the harbour was intact. Still cranes and everything could be used. And most of the other places, like the other ports we took, the Germans had blown up the cranes and stuff, couldn't use the ports properly.
But there was one major problem. Antwerp is connected to the sea by a 45-mile-long estuary of the River Scheldt, which was still heavily mined and defended by the Germans. The Allies couldn't land supplies in Antwerp until the Scheldt had been cleared.
Once the Scheldt Estuary was cleared, the Allies could turn that into their main supply port, which would be sufficient to supply pretty much their entire war effort for the remaining campaign as they drove into Germany. And of course, the Germans knew that as well.
The Germans had built heavy coastal gun batteries on Walcheren Island, dominating the West Scheldt Estuary and making it impossible for Allied ships to reach Antwerp. The guns along the estuary were protected by thick concrete bunkers, almost impervious to air attack. They could only be taken by ground assault, across a landscape of rivers and open mudflats, with approaches covered by artillery and anti-tank guns, and beaches strewn with barbed wire and minefields. This hugely challenging assignment was given to the 1st Canadian Army, a multinational force made up of 2 Canadian and 2 British infantry divisions, with 1 Canadian and 1 Polish armoured division. The army included many Normandy veterans, but their hard-won combat experience was now being diluted by the arrival of raw recruits to replace casualties.
Some of them had been in the army less than 6 months. They brought them overseas, crossed the channel, onto the trucks and up to the front, and dumped them off. As we were trying to whip everybody into shape, they didn't know how to load a rifle, they didn't know how to prime a grenade, they knew nothing about infantry work.
In command of the army was Lieutenant General Guy Simonds. Simonds was a born soldier who'd won the Sword of Honour at Canada's Royal Military College. An expert in the evolving art of mechanized warfare, his rise to senior command had been meteoric, leading a division in Sicily and a corps in Normandy. When his boss, Lieutenant General Crerar, commanding 1st Canadian Army, fell ill, Simonds was the obvious replacement, and at 41 became the Western Allies' youngest army commander by 7 years.
Very British Canadian, he had been born in Britain. His father had been an officer in the British Army. His grandfather had been an officer in the army of the East India Company. Very highly regarded by Montgomery, by Eisenhower and by Bradley, perhaps in contrast to the actual commander of 1st Canadian Army, General Sahari Crerar, a Canadian who was found to be a little difficult to work with. The other way of looking at that is that they regarded Simonds as a good officer because he thought much the same way that they did, that Montgomery found Simonds easier to cooperate with, and so did many others.
Simonds' job was made more difficult by fierce disagreements about Allied strategy that autumn. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, favoured an advance against Germany on a broad front. But British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery believed that a single thrust across the Rhine River would get the Allies to Berlin and end the war by Christmas. Such a move, if successful, would make German defences along the Scheldt irrelevant. So that September, Simonds' advance on the Scheldt was put on pause, while Montgomery launched his ambitious airborne operation, codenamed Market Garden. But Market Garden ended in disaster.
The paratroopers took the bridges and held them until we got there. We took over from the American paratroopers at Nijmegen, and the next one after that was Arnhem, and that's the one they couldn't get. And that's where our paratroopers dropped in and got slaughtered.
And of course they had Market Garden, the airborne, bridge too far. They had that, and that failed. So they said, well, we've got to get Antwerp open.
The failure of Operation Market Garden not only cost lives and resources. By delaying the Canadian attack on the Scheldt, the task had been made significantly harder. The Germans made good use of their 4 weeks' breathing space, moving thousands of reinforcements into position along the estuary. By the time Montgomery accepted that clearing the Scheldt Estuary must be the new priority, German defences were more formidable than ever. That October, the Western Allies were relying on 1st Canadian Army to get the job done. It was up to them to clear German defenders from the Scheldt Estuary, so that urgently needed supplies and reinforcements could make it through to the port of Antwerp. Until now, 1st Canadian Army's efforts had been overshadowed by events elsewhere, but no longer. The Canadian plan involved 4 phases. Phase 1, 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by 4th Canadian Armoured, would push north from Antwerp to secure Woensdrecht and Bergen op Zoom at the neck of the South Beveland Peninsula. Phase 2, 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 1st Polish Armoured would eliminate German forces along the south bank of the Scheldt. Phase 3, Canadian troops would advance up the narrow South Beveland Peninsula, before Simonds launched Phase 4, an attack on Walcheren Island by land and sea. One of the biggest challenges facing the troops would be the treacherous landscape. The terrain was wet and boggy, with open country crossed by dikes and waterways.
The land around the Scheldt was polder territory. This meant that it had been reclaimed from the sea. The land was divided up by dikes, and between them, it had been flooded by the Germans.
They had flooded the land, and you're in water all the time. The only protection you get is if you try to get too high on the what do you call the dikes, then you're a target.
The dikes themselves were steep embankments, like ramparts, about 14 feet high, and made ideal defensive positions for the Germans. With hardly any usable roads for tanks, the struggle for the Scheldt would be overwhelmingly an infantry battle.
Why didn't the Air Force just go and flatten the place? Just flatten the place. They got all kinds of ammunition. No, send the infantry in there. It's terrible, terrible.
More than ever, Canadian soldiers would rely on the weapons and equipment they could haul forwards themselves over the flooded plains and steep embankments.
The Canadian Army in 1944 were equipped and armed almost identically to the British Army, and that went for the tactics and training too. Every platoon, most men were armed with the No. 4 Lee Enfield rifle. The section commanders were all armed with Sten submachine guns. But unlike the Germans, which was very, very beautifully made, high-precision engineering, these were cheap. The whole thing made for 15 shillings. There were only two pieces which were machined, the barrel and the breech block. The rest of it just made out of stamped steel, welded together. But actually, they weren't that reliable. The main infantry support weapon was the Bren light machine gun. The Bren was an incredibly accurate, beautifully designed weapon, completely reliable, and was quite capable of putting 2 bullets through the same hole with a well-trained gunner. These weapons and tactics, which had been honed in the fighting since Normandy, suddenly meant nothing in the fighting in the Scheldt because the land was flooded, there wasn't the opportunity for manoeuvre, and the troops were funneled through drainage ditches, through dikes, and across causeways. So they were having to advance on an incredibly narrow front. And on the other side, the Germans knew exactly where they would be coming from.
Those German defenders were being exhorted to ever greater levels of sacrifice by their Führer, who had implemented a new strategy, the Festung, or fortress city.
Hitler designated certain areas as fortress zones or fortress cities, and his goal was really to invigorate the defenders of those cities, to make them fight to the last man, to not surrender, to sell themselves as dearly as possible, and really to destroy the usefulness of those areas in the process. He did this with a number of port cities. He did this with the estuary outside of Antwerp. And the goal was really to slow the Allies down as much as possible.
But that summer, the German army had suffered disastrous losses in men and equipment, both in France and on the Eastern Front. It was now relying increasingly on teenagers and second-rate conscripts. The ragtag mix of divisions holding the Scheldt typified the Wehrmacht's diminished strength. 64th Division, defending the south bank of the Scheldt, was the strongest, with 11,000 men and a large number of heavy weapons. The 3 divisions of 67 Corps, holding the area north of Antwerp, were at half strength, and most were poorly trained. While 70th Division, holding Walcheren Island, was made up of men who, until recently, had been classed as medically unfit for service.
Previous fighting and the huge casualties had inflicted so many losses on the German army that they were simply not able to find enough recruits to refill their ranks. So what they did at that particular time is that they would go into hospitals, to military hospitals, and also draft people who up to that point had been medically unfit, and would draft them into specific units.
You see what are called stomach battalions of men who are otherwise fit but who need a special diet. Ear battalions of men who have ear damage or hearing damage and need special doctors. Or foot battalions. All of these are simply being put back into the line, not as first-class infantry, but as men who can still fight.
On the 2nd of October, the Canadian 2nd Infantry Division opened the Battle of the Scheldt with an attack north from Antwerp. Their objective was to secure access to the South Beveland Peninsula, isolating German forces from the Dutch mainland. But they would need to fight their way through the villages of Hoogheide and Woensdrecht. At first, the Canadians made steady progress, overcoming sporadic German resistance and liberating several small villages on the Dutch-Belgian border. But as they neared their objective, they ran into a strong defensive network of roadblocks, anti-tank ditches, and assault guns. It was typical of the well-planned German defenses the Allies encountered throughout the battle.
Germans had lots of time to prepare for us coming. I can remember they even had numbers on top of the roofs, 264 or something. And that was the infantry would see that number and call back for artillery fire. And they'd be able to, very quickly, be able to know exactly where that was. And so they used to shell us, but they had lots of time to prepare.
On the 7th of October, bitter fighting erupted around Hoogheide and Woensdrecht, with the Germans determined to keep control over the crucial access to South Beveland.
The town of Hoogheide, which overlooked Woensdrecht, and they had heavy artillery, mortars at a very, very short distance. You could see the people operating the weapons on that hill.
The German 15th Army had clear orders from its commander. The people and Führer of Germany were watching, they were told. The Scheldt defences must be held to the end. That commander was General Gustav Adolf von Sangen. An experienced officer who'd led a division on the Eastern Front, he'd been given command of 15th Army in the Calais region of France 6 weeks earlier. Despite heavy Allied attacks, he'd successfully withdrawn his units to Holland and established a formidable defensive line around the Scheldt.
He was a very driven commander, and he made clear to his troops that the fighting in the Scheldt Estuary was of the utmost importance for the future conduct of war and the future of Germany.
Contrary to the impression given by newsreel propaganda, by autumn 1944, German tanks were in short supply. The very few armoured units at von Sangen's disposal would instead rely on simpler, but highly effective, mobile assault guns.
At the beginning of World War II, the Germans have developed a vehicle called an assault gun, or Sturmgeschütz. And the idea is really you get a tank chassis, you put a support howitzer in it with a superstructure on the top, and that helps the infantry to attack prepared positions. After the invasion of Russia in June of 1941, Hitler makes a suggestion that the 7.5 centimetre anti-tank gun is added to the Sturmgeschütz chassis, and that changes the vehicle into a great tank-killing weapon. One of the issues with the Sturmgeschütz is low in profile because it doesn't have that turret, and that means it's an effective weapon to be able to hide, and it's also, because it's smaller, a harder weapon to hit. As the war progresses, the Germans are trying to thicken the armour, but they're losing some of their production facilities. So if you actually look on this example of a Sturmgeschütz, this extra armour that's been placed on the front is actually concrete, just to thicken the levels of protection for the crew inside. The problem, of course, is this cannot be turned on like a 360 turret. So it's great in the defensive role, but less good in the attack.
The assault guns that stalled the Canadian advance at Hürtgen belonged to a German Kampfgruppe, or battle group.
The near-complete destruction of the larger organization of the German army in the West meant that there were a lot of units that were not with who they had started out with, were not organized, had suffered heavy casualties. And the Germans found that the best way to use them were simply to put them together into an informal group, a Kampfgruppe, and send them back out to fight together.
This particular Kampfgruppe is a very good example of it. Kampfgruppe, or battle group Schill, were named after their commanding officer, Generalleutnant Lieutenant General Schill. The Canadian intelligence report classed him as a very skillful and very driven military commander. They assembled a battle group, a Kampfgruppe of about 3,000 men, consisting of remnants of 3 infantry divisions, in particular the 85th Infantry Division, together with a number of paratroopers. And these 3,000 men became, as the Germans call them, the fire brigade of the Scheldt Estuary. They were one of the most powerful and experienced combat formations that the Germans had. And whenever there was heavy fighting, this particular unit would be sent.
Kampfgruppe Hill put up fierce resistance and launched fast-moving, hard-hitting counterattacks whenever possible. The Canadians suddenly found themselves in the hardest fighting they'd seen since Normandy. The intensity of combat threatened to overwhelm some units, and for one regiment would lead to complete disaster. The Canadian Black Watch had a reputation as an unlucky regiment. In Normandy, in one disastrous attack, its 2 senior officers had been killed, and the regiment cut to pieces. On Friday, the 13th of October, the same regiment was ordered to lead an attack on a railway embankment held by paratroopers of Kampfgruppe Hill. It would go down in Canadian military history as Black Friday.
They held the high ground on the right, and we were down on the flatlands with 2 or 3 polders as our protection. The Germans had the last polder. They had the very last polder. And as soon as you put your head up, there'd be a grenade come at you. And there was the railway tracks on the left with high ground there, which they also occupied. Our purpose was to advance past those polders, get to the railway station and cut off the enemy's movements on the road and the railway. We couldn't do it. We lost all those men. Black Friday the 13th.
The 4 attacking companies of the Black Watch lost 150 men killed, and the embankment remained in German hands.
One of the main problems that the Canadians are facing, which lead to these very high casualty rates, is the fact that communications are very poor. When C Company starts its attack, the preliminary artillery bombardment comes in too early, and so it comes in 30 minutes before the infantry actually starts its attack, which of course gives the Germans enough time to get back into their positions and prepare their weapons for the advancing Canadians.
The Canadians attacked again 3 days later. Finally, through tenacity and sheer weight of fire, they fought their way into what remained of the Dutch village of Woensdrecht. At high cost, the Canadians had cut off the South Beveland Peninsula and the 15,000 Germans defending it. Meanwhile, Simmons had launched the second phase of the battle on the southwest bank of the Scheldt, dubbed the Breskens Pocket. The Canadians' first obstacle was the Leopold Canal. General Simmons believed the attack to clear the Breskens Pocket, codenamed Operation Switchback, would take 4 days. It began on the 6th of October with an assault across the Leopold Canal. For some companies, the crossing was carried out in eerie silence.
We were under orders not to shoot unless we were attacked. And we suddenly realized the Germans must be under the same order too, because they see us, but they're not shooting anything either. So it was a kind of a silence on the canal.
A few Canadian companies got across the canal without coming under fire. But others were not so lucky and ran into fierce opposition, taking heavy losses. Allied intelligence, it later emerged, had seriously underestimated the strength of German forces in the Breskens Pocket. Slowly, the Canadians carved out a bridgehead on the far bank of the canal. Walter Balfour, a machine gunner with the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, spotted a German artillery observer guiding fire onto his unit.
So I opened up on them with the Bren gun. I had rolled down off the top of the dike because they opened up with a machine gun right away on trying to cut the top of the dike. But later on, the other troops farther up said they saw 2 German stretcher bearers come out very cautiously, wondering whether they might, whether they were going to be shot or what, they could get. And they didn't bother let them. They said they went up to where this brush pile was and loaded a guy on the stretcher and took him out. But that solved the problem for these guys who were on the bottom of at the canal bank. Because he was creating a lot of havoc, a lot of rough times for them.
As the attack across the canal ran out of momentum, Simmons launched the Canadian Highland Brigade in a daring amphibious flanking attack on Hoofdplaat. The attack would be made with the help of an extraordinary new amphibious vehicle, originally designed for a somewhat sunnier climate.
This vehicle's what's called a buffalo, and it was developed from a design to pick up people in the Florida Everglades. The idea being that it can float, but it's also got tracks. The tracks were developed in a way that they've got these scoops on, so as they turn, they can propel a vehicle through water. Now, the American military liked the idea, and the British and Canadian forces use them as well. So to clear the Scheldt Estuary and the island of Walcheren at the end of it, a number of operations took place. And that's when the Buffalo, with its amphibious capability, its ability to take men across boggy ground, crossing rivers, dikes, even the open sea, it came into its own.
But the Canadians had had almost no time to train with the new amphibious vehicles, forcing the operation to be postponed by 24 hours. When the attack went ahead, it was a complete success. Canadian infantry landing behind the German lines, virtually unopposed. The Germans immediately concentrated every available gun against this dangerous new bridgehead. Doug Vidler was a mortarman with the Canadian Highland Brigade.
It was a bad night. We'd been up all night. We didn't get to bed till 8 o'clock or something in the morning, but around 11 o'clock, a shell hit the top of our barn, and the shrapnel and dust and everything all came down. And Bob was laying beside me, and we were laying under a manger kind of thing. The word went out, anybody hit? And Blackie said he was hit. He got hit in the knee. So with that, I shook Bob and said, Bob, Blackie's hit. And with that, Bob rolled over. He had one little piece of shrapnel on his head. Just one little piece, hardly bled at all. And he was gone.
For 3 days, Doug Vidler and his comrades held on to their fragile bridgehead. Finally, tank destroyers and infantry of 4th Canadian Armoured Division broke through to relieve them. The German position in the Breskin's pocket was now hopeless. But the German commander ordered his men to fight on, even though many frontline units had lost 2/3 of their men, and most of the survivors were ready to give up. Canadian 3rd Division began a relentless, methodical advance across the pocket, smashing any point of German resistance with concentrated artillery fire and airstrikes. Ochil Stewart, a D-Day veteran, entered what he took to be a recently liberated Dutch village.
Everything was deathly silence as I got into the town. Not a soul, not a sound. And just behind me, out of the windmill, came the Burgermeister with about 20 of his town people. And so I went over to them. They hugged me and kissed me, and I said, did you not get all this hugging and kissing out of your system when the infantry came through yesterday? Oh, you're the first one. The infantry were repulsed by the Germans. They're back a mile or so. You're the first one.
On the 3rd of November, the pocket finally fell, with the surrender of the German divisional commander and the rest of his troops. The Canadians were slowly tightening their grip on the estuary, though at a heavy price. Now it was time to launch their final assault on Walcheren Island and the coastal guns that dominated the Scheldt. For both sides, autumn on the Dutch coast promised to be wet and freezing cold.
There wasn't a guy whose main objective was to find a warm, dry place where he could have a good sleep. Never mind the German. Where can we find a warm, dry place to have a good sleep? We were all half conscious.
It was cold. There was ice forming on the edge of the canal. The green grass had covered in white frost.
Soldiers fought a daily battle to get warm, stay dry, and find hot food.
The Scheldt was freezing cold. The Canadians find themselves having to fight in greatcoats, in the thick woolen greatcoats. They're wearing balaclavas. They have leather jerkins on, anything to keep warm and to try and keep the water out. The Canadian and British rations weren't very imaginative. In fact, nowhere near as exciting as the menus that the American Army often had. Amongst the things that they got in their 24-hour ration packs were 10 of these biscuits, which was basically a bread substitute, and these could be broken up and used for making breadcrumbs and other things. There would be meat extract, blocks of meat, oatmeal blocks. There were 2 bars of chocolate, boiled sweets, chewing gum, salt. So all sorts of things to make very, very simple food. And you would cook these on a little hexamen stove, which you carried in your pack, which opened out like this. You'd have a hexamen block, which is the fuel, which would sit in the space underneath. And once you'd lit it, you could then put your food into the mess tin, put it on top of the stove, and cook it off. Another innovation at the time was self-heating tins of food, like this tin of mock turtle soup. And the idea here was that you would take your army jackknife, you would punch 2 holes in the side of the lid, lever off the cap, and then light the fuse inside, leave it for 5 minutes, and when you cut it open, it would be steaming hot soup ready to eat.
Added to the general discomfort of Canadian troops was a growing crisis of combat fatigue. The Canadian 2nd and 3rd Infantry Divisions had been in almost constant combat since Normandy, and because of a Canadian law governing overseas service, they weren't getting enough replacements from home.
The Canadian Army was starting to experience substantial manpower issues late in 1944. In addition to the casualties they had experienced during the earlier fighting, the Canadian Army in Europe was built out of people who had actually volunteered to leave Canada and fight in Europe. Not everybody did that, and that meant that the Canadians were facing a shortage of people who were willing to fight in Western Europe. In addition to the shortage itself, the Canadian troops who were actually in Europe were beginning to get a little worn down, and there was no relief in sight. More and more Canadian soldiers began to break down under the strain, whether physically wounded, physically ill, or battlefield exhaustion.
In the First World War, they called the guy shell shock. We called it battle fatigue. Guys got battle fatigue a couple of weeks after we got into action. And they were no good anymore, most of them. They sent them back to what we called anyway, a sleep camp. And they'd give a guy a needle and put him to sleep for a day or 2 days and give him a chance to rest up. Keep him there for 3 or 4 days and send him back up. Well, the theory was 2 trips to the sleep camp and you went into a labor battalion. But we were so short of men, we had no labor battalions that I ever heard of, so they kept sending them back. And, you know, it was a damn disgrace. Some of the guys deserted. I had a guy who was a very close friend of mine and a tip-top soldier. But once the mortar shells started coming in, he'd get up and start running around in circles. And I'd have to jump on him and put him down and sometimes punch him out to keep him quiet.
Despite the growing crisis of manpower, 2nd Canadian Infantry were now given another vital role to play in the 3rd phase of the Battle of the Scheldt. General Simmons wanted them to attack west along the narrow peninsula as part of Operation Vitality, ahead of the final assault on the coastal batteries of Walcheren Island. So the weary Canadians prepared for another attack across the broken dikes and flooded fields. They would be facing soldiers of the German 6th Parachute Regiment. Many were as exhausted, physically and psychologically, as the Canadians. But even though the struggle to hold the Scheldt looked increasingly doomed, the Germans continued to fight doggedly. They had at least been safe from Allied air attacks for the last few weeks, thanks to heavy cloud and bad weather. But whenever the skies cleared, Hawker Typhoons and Supermarine Spitfires, armed with rockets and cannon, swarmed in to strafe German positions. John Thompson was the Canadian pilot of a rocket-firing Typhoon.
Anybody on the ground, it sounded like an express train coming, particularly a salvo. And the Germans, they were very leery about when they got attacked by typhoons. They didn't like the noise that several of the German prisoners would say, well, the noise of those rockets is pretty terrifying.
In late October, the Allies used radio intercepts to pinpoint General von Sangen's headquarters and sent 4 squadrons of Typhoons to wipe it out. The attack killed 74 German officers and left 15th Army headquarters in chaos for days. The Canadians hoped to take advantage with a fresh attack along the peninsula. They had learned the lesson of Black Friday. This time, German defences were blasted by a massive artillery barrage before the infantry went in under cover of darkness.
We moved in there about 2 o'clock in the morning and laid in the ditch on one side of the road until about 6, when we were told to charge. The charge was across about 1,000 yards of beet fields, flat as a pancake, nothing there but beets, and to take a dike on the far side being held by the German. We hardly got across the road when we had to retreat back into the ditch because of the machine gun, and the fire was so heavy you couldn't move. Somehow or other, we worked our way across that beet field to the dike at the end. There was very few of us left when we got there. We couldn't do much, but we spent the rest of the day throwing grenades back and forth, the Germans on one side and us on the other side, and it was just murder. The wounded were laying out in the field, hollering and yelling.
The Canadian infantry struggled forward, and by the end of the first day, they'd breached the first line of German defences and taken 120 prisoners. But the next obstacle was even more formidable: the South Beveland Canal.
The German defense in the South Beveland sector is centered around this particular canal. The canal is a big obstacle to the Allied forces, and it's very difficult for them to cross this under fire. And the Germans therefore include this as an integral part into their defensive plan.
Rather than tackle the canal head-on, General Simmons ordered an outflanking attack by the 52nd Lowland Division, using buffaloes to land at Hürtgen. At a stroke, this bold amphibious operation bypassed the canal and made it worthless as a defensive position. The German troops hurriedly pulled back to Walcheren Island itself, where they would make their last stand, protected by concrete fortifications and coastal batteries. 4 weeks into the battle for the Scheldt, the Allies were closing in on their goal, the naval guns of Walcheren Island.
Blocking the end of the Scheldt Estuary was the island of Walcheren. Walcheren was heavily defended by the Germans. It was basically very flat and low-lying and surrounded by a dike, and the Germans had built concrete pillboxes and guns emplaced around the top of that dike.
Until Walcheren Island was taken and its heavy guns neutralized, no Allied ships could sail up the Scheldt to Antwerp, and the advance on Germany remained stalled through lack of supplies. By now, General Dasser, commanding what Hitler optimistically termed Scheldt Fortress North, could call only on the remnants of 70th Infantry Division, the 89th Fortress Regiment, and 2 battalions of naval gunners. Their orders from the Führer remained clear: fight to the last man. Meanwhile, Canadian Commander Guy Simmons was devising another bold amphibious operation for the final assault on Walcheren Island. First, the RAF would bomb Westkapelle, destroying the island's outer dike and allowing the sea to rush in and flood the interior. Then he would launch 2 amphibious assaults by Scottish infantry and Royal Marine commandos, landing at Vlissingen and Westkapelle, while 2nd Canadian Infantry attacked from the east across the narrow channel separating Walcheren from the mainland.
Montgomery built up a massive assault force to take the Walcheren fortress. Lots of landing crafts, lots of Buffalo amphibious vehicles, and thousands of men, and the plan was essentially a replica of what had happened at Normandy on June 6, 1944. A massive initial bombardment followed by waves of landing craft and amphibious vehicles taking the soldiers ashore to capture the fortress and finally open up Antwerp to Allied supply ships.
The Canadians began their attack on the 31st of October, but reaching the Channel, they soon found it was too deep to cross on foot and too muddy for assault boats. The only option was to advance up the Walcheren Causeway, a single narrow road a mile long, connecting the island to the mainland. Company after company was sent up the causeway, only to get pinned down by heavy German fire.
So they lined the guys up in rows and send them across this damn thing, and you couldn't move. The Jerry's were sitting at the far end, machine gun fire. They had old French 75mm cannons shooting them like machine guns down the middle. And they kept sending more and more guys, and we were given covering fire. I smoked a can of 100 cigarettes in about 3 hours, believe it or not. Just lighting one off the other. We were just changing barrels on the Bren gun. Between their guys and ours, they finally got a half a dozen guys or so to the far end. But that was it.
With the Canadians pinned down on the causeway, the success of the attack would depend on Simmons' amphibious landings. The RAF bombing raid had been a success, blowing giant gaps in the dikes and flooding the island. The way was clear for Allied amphibious vehicles to strike at the heart of the German defensive positions.
When the attack went in, amphibious vehicles like this Buffalo could go through those gaps and round the rear of the dikes and attack the German defences from behind. And the Buffaloes would be perfect for this, because not only could they carry men ashore, they were armour-plated on the front on this LVT-4 model Buffalo, and they were given guns. So it's got a 20mm Polston cannon and Browning machine guns on it that would help put suppressing fire down on the German positions as they come ashore and release the infantry to finish the attack.
Royal Marine Jim Kelly was part of the Buffalo assault wave, but things didn't go quite to plan.
They were put into tank landing craft, and we got into the Buffaloes inside the tank landing craft, so that we were loaded into the Buffalo. But the Buffalo was an amphibious box. We came out the landing craft in this thing, and right away it was bogged down in the water. Never got any further. We had to get out and wade ashore. It's just the same old wet landing. A freezing cold day, 1st of November.
At Vlissingen, the island's main port, the Germans were caught off guard, and British troops landed almost unscathed. But resistance intensified as they moved inland. They were soon engaged in fierce street fighting that would last several days. Meanwhile, off Westkapelle, a covering force of landing craft took on the heavy German shore batteries with rockets and cannon.
They were taking on the batteries, but they were a bit of a one-sided fight. That was, and they lost quite a few. But at least they did the job. They took the fire away from us, so we were able to get in and get on top of the batteries.
Under the cover of this barrage, the Marines got ashore with only light casualties. On the beaches and dikes, they faced no more than sporadic resistance from the Germans. But occasional mortar shells and mines claimed a steady toll. German S-mines, known as Bouncing Bettys, were lethal.
We actually go over the top, just come over the top of the dunes and then start trotting towards and take a chance on the mines. Well, what we used to do, really, on the minefields was up skirts and at them. Because the faster you ran, if you stood on the mine, the better the chance you had of getting away with it. Because it took about 4 seconds to pop up out of the ground to about 6 foot high before it exploded in shrapnel balls. So if you ran fast enough, you could get away with it, which you did. It worked.
The fighting on Walcheren Island lasted 8 days. Then, on the 8th of November, the Germans began to surrender.
The next morning, they would come out with all their gear packed, the little haversacks and whatnot, and they'd come out and just surrender.
With the German coastal batteries neutralized, Royal Navy minesweepers went to work, making the Scheldt Estuary safe for Allied supply ships. On the 28th of November, the first Allied convoy sailed up the Scheldt to unload its precious supplies at Antwerp docks. The first ship to unload was from Canada. The opening of Antwerp was a serious blow to the Third Reich.
The significance of the Scheldt and Antwerp is really underlined by the enemy reaction. More V-2 rockets were aimed at Antwerp than any other place during that part of the war. Antwerp was also highly significant in the terms of Hitler's final offensive in the war, the Ardennes offensive, because the objective there was to retake Antwerp, cut off the supplies, and undermine the whole of the Allied war effort on the Western Front.
The battle for the Scheldt was a hard-fought, 5-week campaign led by Canadian troops who paid a heavy price for their success. Around 7,000 of the 12,000 Allied casualties were Canadians. The battle cost the Germans between 10 and 12,000 men and more than 40,000 prisoners. Victory transformed the situation for the Western Allies and ensured their forces would have the fuel and ammunition they needed for the final push into Germany. But it was a victory for which many Canadians believed, then and now, that their country never received proper recognition.
First ship up the Scheldt was a Canadian destroyer. A lot of dignitaries from the different regiments. Somebody said, "Where are the Canadians?" Nobody invited us. Even though we did a lot in the Battle of the Scheldt Estuary.
In September 1944, as American troops reached the German frontier, they faced a bitter struggle to break through a massive network of defenses that stretched from the Netherlands in the north to Switzerland in the south, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line.
Und wir sagten uns, wir verteidigen hier, weil die Amerikaner praktisch in unser Heimatland eingedrungen sind.
It would be the longest continuous battle fought by the US Army in World War II, with a devastating physical and psychological toll on its troops. This is the story of the battle for the Siegfried Line. By the autumn of 1944, Hitler's Germany was under direct attack on two fronts. On the Eastern Front, Stalin's Red Army had advanced as far as Poland and Romania. In the West, British and American-led forces were nearing the German border and preparing to attack along a broad front to break through into the German homeland. In the Allies' path lay the Siegfried Line, known to Germans as the Westwall, a belt of fortifications stretching nearly 400 miles from the Netherlands to the Swiss border.
The Westwall, or as the Allies called it, the Siegfried Line, was a German defensive structure erected in the interwar period, mainly in the 1930s, on the German-French border as a defensive measure to protect German territory against the French. It was only in 1944 that the Germans realized or remembered that they had this defensive structure. The problem was that the defenses were inadequate, and they also hadn't been maintained, and so the Westwall offered a little bit of support to the Germans, but it was not the threatening defensive line that the Allies thought it was.
Very much as with the Atlantic War, areas were stronger or weaker, but it did at least provide the Germans with fortifications on which they could rest for the winter of 1944-45.
As the Allies drew near, the Germans worked hurriedly to reinforce the Siegfried Line defenses. They had the potential to pose a formidable obstacle. A fortified zone of concrete bunkers and pillboxes, minefields, barbed wire, and concrete obstacles known as dragon's teeth that were impassable to tanks.
I remember the Siegfried Line very easily. As we were coming up to it, it was a lot of concrete emplacements already there, waiting for somebody to attack. And there were underground passages connecting these to them, and they had a lot of artillery firing at us.
The Allies needed to bust through these defenses to advance into Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. But to everyone's surprise, on the 11th of September 1944, a US patrol approached a section of the Siegfried Line near the German-Luxembourg border and found it deserted. Within hours, they'd become the first US troops into Germany, without a shot fired. The commander of US 7th Corps saw an opportunity too good to miss and drew up a plan to break through the Siegfried Line before the Germans could reinforce it. That commander was General Lightning Joe Collins. Joseph Lawton Collins was one of the few generals to see action in both the European and Pacific theaters of war, having commanded an infantry division during the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands in 1943. His division's nickname in the Pacific, Tropic Lightning, led to his own nickname, Lightning Joe. Just before the D-Day landings, General Eisenhower gave the 47-year-old Collins command of 7th Corps, making him the youngest Corps commander in the US Army.
He was a very aggressive, very smart guy who modeled himself to a certain extent on George Patton, and was one of the new wave of much less cautious, much less methodical American general officers who were beginning to appear at that point in the war.
Collins' 7th Corps was one of 3 that made up General Courtney Hodges' US 1st Army. 7th Corps had 2 highly experienced infantry divisions, the 1st and 9th, which had both seen action in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, while the 3rd Armoured Division had been in combat since June and was boldly and aggressively led by General Maurice Rose. Collins turned to General Rose's 3rd Armoured to lead the attack through the Siegfried Line, with the division operating as 2 combat commands, A and B.
The American Combat Command System started up in the 1930s and into the 1940s, and it was at least in part a reaction to the new requirements of industrialized warfare. The Americans discovered that they didn't always need full-size divisions to do everything that they were thinking about, or that full-size divisions didn't have everything they needed within them. And so what they started to do was put together combat commands, which might draw from an armored division, draw from an infantry division, an artillery, an engineer division, and put together units as one big fighting force, commanded by someone who could use them in whatever way was best.
The initial American penetration of the Siegfried Line had been made just south of Aachen. Now, 3rd Armoured's 2 combat commands would attack northeast, near the German town of Hürtgen. Once the tanks had broken through, they'd continue the advance to Stolberg, while 1st Infantry Division swung left to capture the high ground east of Aachen, and 9th Infantry pushed into the Hürtgen Forest to secure 7th Corps' right flank. On the 12th of September, Combat Command A and B began their advance against the Siegfried Line. With tanks providing fire support, infantry working their way forward to outflank pillboxes and bunkers, and engineers clearing obstacles, the Americans began fighting their way through the fortified zone. Over 4 days of combat, the 3rd Armoured advanced an average of 2 miles a day, fighting its way methodically through the belt of defenses. But as US troops neared Stolberg, they ran into a second chain of Siegfried Line defenses, at the same time as they were hit by a series of German counterattacks. There was even a rare appearance by the German Luftwaffe.
That's where I was bombed. Had
250-pound or 500-pound, there's not much difference in them when they get that big, hit the front yard of the building, only 20 to 30 feet from the building itself. I had only made it about halfway down the stairway when the bombs hit. And the concussion from it and so forth blew me the rest of the way down against the wall, and I turned around a couple of times because it blew me down. And I came out on the floor on my hands and knees sliding across the floor, and the German woman that lived there in that building, after it's over and the plane is gone, of course, by this time, and she looks at me and she sort of grins or laughs like and points at me, because she thought it was so funny the way I came down that stair and on my knees, hands and knees on the floor.
General Lightning Joe Collins believed his men had a golden opportunity to charge through the Siegfried Line while its defences were still only half occupied. But instead, he was informed that the vital supplies his men needed to continue their offensive were to be diverted elsewhere. After 4 days of combat, General Collins was forced to suspend his attack on the Siegfried Line. The cause was a severe Allied supply shortage that even ingenious logistical improvisation couldn't solve.
Because they don't have enough rail capacity, the Americans at the end of August established what's called the Red Ball Express, which is they treat French roads as if they're a railway. They make them one way only and establish a circuit for trucks travelling at their height, apparently one every 15 to 30 seconds, down the road to drop off its load, come back again as rapidly as possible. And that lasts through into October. But ultimately, the Allies just can't sustain the number of men with the fuel, and with the equipment, and with the ammunition they need to maintain the broad front without slowing down.
The Allies only had enough supplies for one major attack at a time, and priority was now switched to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's Operation Market Garden. This was a plan to outflank the Siegfried Line to the north, advancing through the Netherlands, over the Rhine and into Germany in a single bold operation. The plan relied on airborne troops seizing and holding several key river bridges, but Monty believed if it succeeded, it could win the war that year. The fallout was that Lightning Joe's 7th Corps and other units in the area would no longer get the fuel and ammo they needed to continue their own attack. The Allies had handed exhausted German forces a crucial breathing space, one their new commander would use to completely overhaul German defences. That new commander was Field Marshal Walter Model, a man so adept at fixing a crisis that he'd been nicknamed the Führer's fireman. Widely regarded as Germany's best defensive general, he was also known for his loyal support for Adolf Hitler and unsympathetic, no-nonsense attitude to those under his command.
He did an awful lot in a short space of time, reorganising units and preparing the defence. And in this, his experience was an ideal background, because he had fought so many defensive battles on the Eastern Front.
The fact that he is a completely driven, also committed soldier are summed up by many accounts that we see, that he was very tough and very hard against his own troops, because he really wanted to achieve things, but also very hard and tough against himself, and for that the people admired and respected him.
Model's Army Group B was responsible for defending the Belgian and Luxembourg frontier with Germany. The area around Aachen was held by the 81st Corps of General Brandenberger's 7th Army. Many of its divisions had been almost completely destroyed during the fighting in France and remained severely under strength. The Corps' 2 panzer divisions could muster barely 20 tanks between them. But through September, reinforcements continued to arrive, including replacement tanks and new Volksgrenadier divisions.
In the autumn of 1944, the Germans build a new type of force. And these forces were the Volksgrenadier divisions. The problem was, for the Germans, the manpower shortage of 1944. So the Volksgrenadier divisions had a lower number of infantry battalions, so the manpower was quite low, and they tried to, at least in theory, overcome that by equipping them with more machines, in particular infantry weapons. What they also tried to achieve was that you would have a very experienced cadre of officers and NCOs, around which you would then form a body of men, maybe recruited from people back from the Reich who hadn't been drafted before, and also, in particular, from surplus numbers from the Air Force and from the Navy that were not being used anymore. This was the theory. In reality, it didn't really work that way. And so even though on paper these are very formidable formations, in reality, they were not as formidable, not as strong, not as good as perhaps the standard units that you would find in the army.
Zusammengewürfelt. Man sah ja auch die verschiedensten Uniformen. Nicht wahr? Dort hatte einer eine Luftwaffenmontur an und es gab auch Leute mit Marinekleidung.
While US forces paused their attack on the Siegfried Line, Nazi officials began to evacuate civilians from the city of Aachen, now threatened by the Allied advance. For Germany, Aachen had limited military value, but great symbolic importance.
Aachen was a deeply historic German city. It had been in existence for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It was Charlemagne's capital during the Frankish Empire, and so the Germans really treasured the city as a historic monument to their nation, to their history. In addition, it was the first major German city that was being attacked by the Allies, and so there was this sense that Germany herself was now under threat.
But Gerhard von Schwerin, commander of 116th Panzer, had already drafted a letter surrendering the city to the Americans.
But he never sent that letter because German reinforcements are rushed into the area and a counterattack is ordered, which stabilizes the front for some time, which then leads to rather heavy fighting in that particular area. This letter, say, was never sent, but it did make its way towards, or through the channels, you might say, towards Hitler, who basically wanted Schwerin persecuted and probably shot, but he very narrowly escaped that particular fate, so he was very lucky.
Meanwhile, to the north, after a week of intense fighting, Montgomery's Operation Market Garden ended in failure, as British troops were unable to break through to airborne units holding Arnhem Bridge. Lightning Joe's 7th Corps would now get the supplies it needed to resume its attack on the Siegfried Line around Aachen. They'd be joined in the battle for the city by the US 19th Corps. September's advance by Collins' 7th Corps had left it holding the Stolberg Corridor, southeast of Aachen. North of the city, 19th Corps launched its attack across the Wurm River near Übach, with the intention of swinging south to link up with US 1st Infantry east of Aachen, cutting off the city. 19th Corps' attack was preceded by major airstrikes, but fighter bombers failed to register a direct hit on a single pillbox, while the artillery's high explosive shells weren't powerful enough to penetrate the concrete bunkers. They would have to be taken by infantry assault. US combat engineers trained infantry units for challenges like this.
We'd take an infantry platoon and have them get a sheep and take the sheep and put it inside the pillbox, and then go out and then have a sample assault where we'd assault the back door, flamethrower into it, fire a bazooka into it, then put the 26-pound charge down the center in. And as soon as that charge went off, then we had the infantry run inside and told them to get that sheep. When they brought it out, they found the sheep was bleeding from its ears and eyes from the shock and concussion. And the infantrymen all decided they didn't want to be inside of a pillbox.
Using tactics like these, 30th Infantry Division captured 50 German pillboxes on the first day. But it was slow attritional fighting and by the third day, 19th Corps had taken 1,800 casualties. On the 8th of October, 7th Corps' 1st Infantry Division joined the attack, taking Crucifix Hill, east of Aachen. But as the noose tightened around the city, there were fewer signs than ever that the Germans were about to give up.
Aachen was the first German city under attack, and the population of the city itself was German. German troops were defending not only their homeland, but German civilians themselves. Both of those things made the German soldiers very motivated to fight hard and fight for a long time.
By the 11th of October, US forces had surrounded the city. An ultimatum from the commander of the US 1st Infantry Division for the city to surrender or face destruction was rejected. And so American aircraft and artillery began to pulverize German positions in and around Aachen. Most civilians had been evacuated, but around 20,000 remained in the city, now trapped by fierce fighting. American infantry evolved new tactics for advancing through the streets. They made use of their overwhelming firepower to demolish entire houses if need be, to silence German resistance points. The cut-off German defenders, 5,000 men from a mix of units, fought stubbornly. But without outside help, their situation was hopeless. And so, east of Aachen, German forces launched a counterattack to try to break the American grip on the city. A regiment of the US 1st Infantry found itself facing the latest German heavy tanks, more powerful than even the legendary Tiger.
Despite the impressive nature of the Tiger I, the German military stops making them in the summer of 1944, and they move on to an even more impressive beast, the King Tiger, or Royal Tiger, Tiger II. And that's built because Hitler insists that the newer 88mm gun, which is even longer, even more powerful, is put on a tank chassis. Hitler's idea is that every year the German military must have a superior vehicle than whatever the enemy are going to be fielding.
When Frank Kamm arrived at the front, he met comrades who had been there when the dreaded Tigers came rolling in.
I visited the engineers up there, and they told me about a Tiger tank that could just run right over their tanks, friendly mines, and roll down the street and stopped at each building and fired around into the basement of the building and kept rolling along, and then turned around at the end of the road and came back firing in the building on the other side of the road. And they were so tough that they couldn't stop them. So those things were scary.
But the Germans only had a handful of these powerful tanks, not enough to turn the tide of the battle. 11 days after the US ultimatum, with much of the city in ruins, Aachen's last German defenders surrendered. It was the Western Allies' longest battle for a city in World War II. Both sides suffered about 5,000 casualties, with 3,500 German soldiers taken prisoner. But the battle to break the Siegfried Line was not over yet, and the next phase would prove an even more challenging environment. 10 miles southeast of Aachen, the Siegfried Line wound through the dense pines and steep ravines of the Hürtgen Forest. Efforts to break the line here would lead to some of the most grueling and costly fighting on the Western Front. While 7th Corps' 1st Infantry Division had been fighting in Aachen, the 9th had plunged into the Hürtgen Forest, an area covering around 50 square miles south of Aachen. Corps Commander Major General Lightning Joe Collins had decided that if the forest remained in German hands, it would give the enemy an ideal base from which to threaten his southern flank as his men advanced east from Aachen. But the American decision to fight through this almost impassable terrain puzzled the Germans.
Wir auf deutscher Seite haben uns eigentlich immer gewundert, weshalb die Amerikaner versuchten, durch den Hürtgenwald zu kommen. Die hatten eine Überlegenheit mit Panzern von, sagen wir mal, 20:1 oder noch mehr. Die wären von Aachen aus mit ihren Panzern in wenigen Tagen über die Ebene am Rhein gewesen. Nein, Die wollten unbedingt durch den dichten Hürtgenwald.
Hidden amongst the thick pine woods were concrete pillboxes, supported by minefields, trenches and wooden bunkers. The few routes through the forest wide enough for tanks were littered with mines. One American unit counted a German anti-tank mine every 8 paces for 3 miles. In the face of such formidable defences, it took the 9th Infantry 10 days to advance just 3,000 yards, at the cost of 4,500 casualties. It set the pattern for weeks of grueling combat, as more and more units were committed in an effort to bludgeon their way through the forest. In late October, the worn-out 9th Division was relieved by fresh troops of the Pennsylvanian 28th Infantry, in preparation for a new phase of the American battle to break through the Siegfried Line. The 28th Division had arrived in France a few weeks after D-Day. Its 3 infantry regiments had seen heavy fighting in Normandy, before marching down the Champs-Élysées in the parade to celebrate the liberation of Paris. But Hürtgen Forest would be unlike anything the division had seen or trained for. The 28th Division was to play a key role in the Allied advance towards the next objective, the Ruhr River. It would make a preliminary attack through the Hürtgen Forest to capture the important crossroads town of Schmidt and secure the flank of the main advance. This would be followed by the main attack, codenamed Operation Queen, which would see 7th Corps and 19th Corps push east towards their objective, the main town of Düren on the Ruhr. But a US advance through the Hürtgen Forest would threaten secret German preparations for a major winter offensive in the Ardennes Forest.
Unbeknownst to the Americans, their advance on Schmidt presented a serious strategic threat to the Germans. If the Americans captured Schmidt, they would actually be able to threaten the German buildup areas for the Ardennes counteroffensive. And so the Germans realized that they had to defend both the Hürtgen Forest and Schmidt itself against the American assault, because otherwise the entire counteroffensive would become difficult, if not impossible.
The US 28th Division would face heavier resistance than expected, and its commander already had serious concerns about his orders. The division was led by General Norman Dutch Cotter, a career soldier and West Point graduate who'd become a D-Day legend after coming ashore at Omaha Beach with the second wave and personally leading a charge through the enemy wire. He'd won the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that day, and 2 months later was given command of the 28th Infantry Division, after its previous commander was killed by a German sniper. Cotter didn't believe his division was experienced or strong enough to clear the Germans from the forest. But his complaints fell on deaf ears, and on the 2nd of November, the 28th Division began its attack. Many GIs advanced through the forest with a sense of dread.
We didn't, of course, know where we were. We had no idea what we were in. Each of us was wanting the same thing. Which one of us is going to get killed first? Is one of us going to get that $1 million wound to go home? Is one of us going to get an arm blown off? We're going into combat, and they're shooting real bullets up there.
One regiment immediately walked into a large, unmarked minefield. Another was ambushed by expertly camouflaged German pillboxes in the forest and pinned down.
Die Amerikaner griffen an, die sahen uns nicht, wir waren ja bestens getarnt. Und greifen sie mal in der Dunkelheit und im Nebel und bei diesem Witterungsverhältnis Infanterie an, die in eingegrabenen Stellungen sitzen. Das ist die Hölle.
On the 3rd of November, American infantry took the town of Schmidt. Model, alarmed at the threat to preparations for the German winter offensive through the Ardennes, immediately ordered powerful counterattacks. At dawn the following day, German infantry attacked, supported by tanks of the 116th Panzer Division. The single American battalion holding Schmidt had no tanks or anti-tank guns to take on the panzers, just bazookas. It was clear that the 28th Division was going to lose all its gains without immediate tank support. But getting 35-ton tanks up the forest trails had so far proved impossible. Army engineers were now given just a few hours to make the forest trail to Schmidt passable, using hand tools and a single bulldozer. 3 Shermans finally made it up the track, just in time to help fight off the German panzers' counterattack. But the lead US regiment was under sustained assault by the best part of 2 German divisions. The Germans retook Schmidt, while the Americans desperately held out in the neighboring village of Kommerscheid. The forest was so dense it was impossible to maintain a front line, so infiltration and flanking attacks by small squads of infantry were a constant threat. General Cotter, for all his famed courage, was struggling to hold his division together, issuing orders for counterattacks that were so unrealistic, some junior commanders simply ignored them.
We had been let down by the senior officers, that they simply didn't understand what was going on. They'd wipe out a company, and then they'd send another company in to do exactly the same attack that had failed before. They didn't seem to be learning from it.
Bad decisions led to thousands of casualties. Up to a third were classed as non-battle and included trench foot, frostbite and dysentery. But combat took its toll in many ways, and prolonged exposure to battle resulted in psychological disorders. 26% of all US troops who served in combat units between June and November 1944 reported sick with combat fatigue at some time or another.
As more and more men broke down because of combat fatigue, rather than being punished, they were taken off the line, they were treated, some of them were sent back home for good, a lot of them were given a chance to recover. But the Army handled them pretty effectively over the long term because they knew that this was just something that happened to every soldier eventually. The other thing about combat fatigue was that the other soldiers recognized it and weren't dismissive or contemptuous of the men who experienced it. To a certain extent, there was a sense that, oh, this could be me. And so they tended to treat those folks who broke down mentally in combat with a kind of rough kindness.
In extreme cases, the misery and dread of frontline service drove some soldiers to go absent without leave.
Desertion was also a serious problem, and the only US soldier to actually be shot for desertion during the course of the war was Private Eddie Slovik. And that was a result of this campaign.
The decision to execute Eddie Slovik was approved by Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, deeply concerned by low morale among US units that winter. Slovik had been part of the ill-fated 28th Division, which continued to struggle forward through the Hürtgen Forest. General Lightning Joe Collins had planned for the 7th Corps to reinforce the division as part of a major attack codenamed Operation Queen on the 5th of November. But bad weather delayed the preliminary air bombardment for day after day. The 28th Division were left in the forest to bear the brunt of the German counterattacks on their own. Then, in the midst of the fighting, along a fiercely contested supply route through the forest known as the Cowl Trail, there was a moment of rare and courageous mercy.
Sind wir zu den Amerikanern mit einer weißen Fahne hingegangen, rübergegangen,
Sie waren auf der anderen Seite des Flusses, der Kall.
3 times a day for 5 days, both sides paused the fighting and came together to help evacuate wounded soldiers. Dr. Gunther Hürtgen was a medic for the German 89th Infantry Division.
Ich hatte in meinem Bunker immer amerikanische Sanitätssoldaten, die mir halfen bei der Versorgung von amerikanischen Verwundeten, die antransportiert wurden. Und dann machte ich ihnen klar, dass sie keine Gefangenen wären und sie könnten wieder zurückgehen.
They even devised a way of sharing the water of the Cow River without the fear of being attacked.
Ich hatte den Vorschlag gemacht, bin zu den entsprechenden Offizieren gegangen und habe denen gesagt, also lass uns doch, die Deutschen, ihr waschen sich von 8 bis 9 und ihr von ab 9 bis 10. Ja? Und das war eine Abmachung, die eben auch eingehalten wurde. Das erinnerte jetzt nachblickend in der Analyse, es war fast kriegsspielartig.
But the respite was short-lived. On the 16th of November, with no end to the bad weather in sight, General Hodges ordered Operation Queen to go ahead, with or without the bombers. Miraculously, after 13 days of constant rain, the weather cleared at the last moment. More than 1,500 heavy bombers poured high explosive onto Siegfried Line defences and towns along the Ruhr River Valley.
The effects were devastating. The towns that were hit by the bombers were basically obliterated. The communication lines were cut. And the effects on the morale, particularly of the inexperienced soldiers, was quite severe. Having said that, in the combat zone itself, where you had more of the experienced German soldiers, the effects were far less. There are a number of reasons for this. First of all, the bombing wasn't all that accurate in that particular area. And also a lot of the more experienced soldiers and their morale were not hit that badly. And it's interesting that after the bombing raid, even the Allied commanders said that the bombing had not lived up to their expectations.
In the aftermath of the bombing raid, Collins' 7th Corps launched its attack through and north of the Hürtgen Forest. They'd have to fight their way through a series of well-defended villages with the aim of securing new priority objectives, the Ruhr River dams, the significance of which had only just been grasped.
During the fighting, the Germans were thinking of blowing the dams of the River Ruhr. The idea behind that was that by blowing the dams, well, first of all, they would create a water wall which would move towards the Allies and hopefully sweep away some of the troops. But even more importantly, it would create a bit of, you might say, a swamp area and would widen the River Ruhr to about 1.5 kilometers, which made it very, very difficult for the Allies to cross. So creating a rather severe water obstacles to the advancing Allies.
The Americans knew that the Ruhr dams were there, but they had sort of lost focus on them in an attempt to secure their flank by taking the Hürtgen Forest. General Hodges of the American Army wasn't the most intelligent, most aggressive commander, and he was having trouble tracking everything that was going on. In the process, the dams sort of got lost in the mess.
US commanders finally understood that they could not safely cross the Ruhr River while the dams remained intact in German hands. But the shattered 28th Division would take no part in this attack. Cota's men were finally being pulled out of the line.
I felt, oh my God, we're getting out of this meat grinder. And the next day we got on the trucks and away we went. Down the mountains, over the rivers, through the woods. It was like luxury.
But for the veteran US 1st Infantry Division, it was the start of their Hürtgen Forest ordeal. On the first day of Operation Queen, they attacked the village of Hamish, where Harley Reynolds and his unit encountered a lethal new German infantry weapon.
The Germans had developed a pistol that shot a grenade, and they had developed this pistol. The idea was there all the time, but we'd never run up against them until this night. And they had developed it was a flare gun. Shoots a flare, just like you carry on your boat, for an example, if you're out on the water. But instead of a flare, it shot a grenade. Now, this is close quarters. You're talking about 20 to 30 yards, but that was one wicked thing, and it's our first time to ever run up against it. And they just slaughtered us. And it was 23 people that was left from the company.
It took 4 days for the 1st Division to take Hamish, at the cost of 1,000 casualties. Fighting the terrain, as well as a well-entrenched and skillful enemy, American infantry advanced at a snail's pace, about 1.5 miles in 5 days. American armor struggled in the muddy, heavily mined tracks of the forest. What's more, they were stalked by German infantry, equipped with handheld anti-tank weapons.
So the Panzerfaust can be used by units like the Volksgrenadiers in the Hürtgen Forest. They can creep up on tanks through the woods, and this very simple weapon can penetrate the armor on the front or the sides of a Sherman tank. So literally pennies are being used to knock out thousands of pounds worth of equipment.
All units in the Hürtgen Forest suffered a horrifying rate of attrition. For those on the front line, the nightmare seemed unending. Americans had given the forest a grisly nickname, the Death Factory. And with winter closing in, conditions were only getting more miserable.
I'd have to describe it in this way. In the beginning of winter, back in Virginia, where I grew up, it starts with a very cold blowing wind and just snow flakes, just here and there. But the flakes aren't actually flakes. They're in little balls like pellets. And that was all I saw of snow in the Hürtgen Forest while I was there. We knew the winter was coming.
November 1944. The US 1st and 9th Armies were waging a grim winter offensive along a 15-mile front in an attempt to push through the Siegfried Line to the Ruhr River and then on to the Rhine itself. On the southern flank of the advance, US infantry were pinned down in the Hürtgen Forest, unable to make any headway through the wooded maze of ravines, minefields, and bunkers.
Dadurch alles das, was jetzt am Boden lag, konnten sich eigentlich in keiner Hinsicht still bewegen. Sie machten immer Krach, irgendwo knackte immer irgendwas. Und das hat natürlich die eine wie die andere Seite bemerkt und da wurde dann Feuer eröffnet.
One US regiment lost 200 men in a single day, and all 3 of its battalion commanders. Losses were so bad that some companies got through 3 or 4 commanding officers in a month. Many were below half their normal strength of 190 men. The need for replacements was more urgent than ever. But when new recruits were sent to frontline units to replace the casualties, they often struggled to fit in amongst the veterans.
The American manpower system was one of the great failings of American organization during World War II. The Americans, rather than pulling units off the line when they experienced heavy casualties and rebuilding them, would simply send out individual soldiers as replacements. And this IRR, Individual Ready Replacement System, turned out to not work very well at all. Among other things, it meant that they were sending new soldiers to veteran units who didn't know them, who had no connection to them, who had no chance to train with them ahead of time, and those units weren't terribly welcoming.
But the veterans weren't simply trying to be cruel. They were protecting themselves.
So these new replacements would come out, and they would be incredibly vulnerable the first couple of weeks with the new unit, because they just didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what the sound of a German machine gun was like compared to the sound of an American. They didn't know how to move through forests quietly. And so not only would they get themselves killed, but they'd get the other soldiers killed. One of the results of this, in a kind of horrifying way, is that a lot of the veteran soldiers refused to even learn the names of the replacements until they'd been with the unit long enough that those veteran soldiers had some sense that they would survive. It wasn't worth getting to know the new guy if he was just going to be dead the next day.
You know, big boys don't cry, you know, and you're not supposed to get so attached. And that's the thing we tried not to do, because we get new replacements, get to know them by their first name. 2 days later, they're dead. And we're talking about 70% turnover all the time. If we had an 8-man squad, which is supposed to be 12, we thought that was a big deal. Hardly ever remember being full strength. They just killed us all the time.
In the last week of November, fresh attacks were made by 5th Corps towards Grosshau at the eastern edge of the forest and the town of Hürtgen. American infantry faced all the usual problems of fighting through the Hürtgen Forest. At Grosshau, just 2 Sherman tanks made it up the trails to support the attack. Both were immediately knocked out by German assault guns. At Hürtgen, American tanks coming up the road encountered craters and anti-tank mines. The lead tanks were soon immobilized, blocking the road for those behind. But thanks to a sudden break in the weather, Allied fighter-bombers were able to strafe and bomb German positions, and US infantry eventually took both villages. The American advance was inching forward at the cost of enormous casualties. And still, the Ruhr River dams were not in sight. And so Allied commanders turned to air power to destroy them. In early December, RAF bombers attacked the dams 3 times, but there was no repeat of the spectacular Dam Busters' success. The dams were made of packed earth and almost impossible to hit amid constant winter cloud cover. They would have to be taken by ground troops after all. Frank Kamm's unit arrived at the front on the 13th of December and quickly got a taste of the fog of war in the freezing forest.
We had several different infantry platoons attack that first night on the 13th of December, and some of our soldiers got caught behind German lines. While it was dark, they had to try to get out, and they came across a German trench and were walking through the German trench when they ran into German soldiers. And the Germans would say something to them, and they just grunted back and kept on going. And they walked through the German lines and then came on out. So sometimes you engage them, and if they don't know who you are, you're all right.
German soldiers were also under immense pressure and faced the terrifying might of Allied firepower.
Und nachts war ich alleine. Nur Krachen, keine Verbindung mehr. Ich kann nur sagen, es kurz zu sagen, in dieser Nacht habe ich beten gelernt.
US troops, with the advantage in numbers and firepower, made steady progress towards the Ruhr River, while Hill 400, a crucial vantage point, was taken by an elite US Ranger battalion in a head-on charge. After months of bitter fighting, US 1st and 9th Armies finally reached the Ruhr River. Siegfried Line defenses, the horrors of Hürtgen Forest, and a skillful German defense meant they'd been forced to pay an exceptionally heavy price, and still hadn't made the breakthrough they'd hoped for. But as American commanders prepared for yet another assault towards the Ruhr dams, on the 16th of December, 25 miles to the south, Hitler launched a surprise midwinter offensive through the Ardennes forest. It was the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last great offensive in the west, and meant troops in the Hürtgen Forest would be left holding their positions for the rest of a harsh winter.
At that point, the Battle of the Bulge was triggered, which went from December of 1944 into January of 45. They had pulled away all of our artillery support, all of our air support, and we had to dig in at the Ruhr River. It was cold and miserable, and fighting through the elements was a war in itself for us.
It was an indecisive end to a deeply flawed Allied campaign.
Hürtgen Forest was probably one of the bigger setbacks for the Allies on the Western Front. It was intended to really break through the Siegfried Line in that area, and it didn't do that. And in addition, the Allies took massive casualties fighting their way through the terrain of the forest itself. And so the final result is they didn't really achieve what they were aiming for, and they lost more than 30,000 casualties doing it.
The defense of the Hürtgen Forest can be seen as a German victory. The Germans inflicted higher casualties on the Allies, the Americans, than they sustained themselves. The Germans lose somewhere in the region of about 28,000 casualties, whereas the Americans lose about 33,000 casualties, plus about 9,000 non-combat casualties. So some of the units have a 25% casualty rate, which is extremely high for American units. So at that particular level, yes, you might say it was a victory. It also slowed down the Allied advance, and the Germans were able to hold on to more of their territory. From an operational and strategic point of view, the answer is probably different. You might say, well, operationally it didn't really achieve all that much, whereas strategically it didn't have any effect at all, and Germany still lost the war.
The duration and intensity of fighting in the Hürtgen Forest would traumatize survivors on all sides.
Ich sehe dort heute noch die ganzen Toten liegen. Die amerikanischen Soldaten, die deutschen Soldaten, alles gemischt, die ganzen Felder voll.
General Dutch Coter's battered 28th Division, who'd been left out on a limb in Hürtgen Forest, were moved south to a quiet sector to recover. But in a grim irony, they found themselves in the path of Hitler's surprise winter offensive through the Ardennes. Not until the Battle of the Bulge had been won could Allied forces along the Siegfried Line resume their offensive and begin the final advance into the heart of Nazi Germany.